Welcome to The Beat. I'm Ari Melber, and tonight the courts are assessing this legality of the scenes that President Trump has pushed now for over a week, deploying the National Guard without a governor, and sometimes the Marines in California to show force as part of the larger mass deportation raids agenda. It's a level of force that also only seemed to rally even more resistance over this weekend in those massive No Kings protests that we saw. This is one of those things that can happen in our country, but when you actually realize the scope and scale of it, even if you heard about it or may know someone who went, or you may have gone over the weekend. But going to one protest is different than realizing that here we are now in a week in America where we have hit this inflection point, 5 million people turning out at those protests, demanding change and saying no to some of the things that Donald Trump is doing. So an appeals court held a hearing here looking at California's argument because they took Trump to court to try to stop the use of the Guard. We're going to go inside that court hearing shortly, basically in a couple moments, while we begin with the related powers that Trump is wielding that were put on blast today by Democratic California Senator Alex Padilla. You remember this video that went all around the nation. Today, he gave an unusual address on the Senate floor about that forcible removal at the DHS press conference. Padilla using a special moment in this unusual Senate floor speech to say President Trump is acting like a, quote, tyrant.
Throughout this country's history, we've had conflict, we've had tumult, but we've never had a tyrant as a commander-in-chief. How many Americans in the year 2025 see a vindictive president on a tour of retribution, unrestrained by the majority of this separate and co-equal branch of government, and wonder if it's worth it to stand up or to speak out? No one will redeem America but Americans. No one is coming to save us but us.
No one's coming to save us but us. Padilla stepping up to what might be a different role that started when he had that confrontation at the DHS event, presenting himself as a possibly different kind of Democrat, trying to meet this moment against the backdrop of these unusual displays of force and those protests mentioned. Now, let's be clear about the contrast to his pinning to the ground and handcuffing by those federal agents, which now more people may have seen him in that moment than anything else he might have done in his public career. Well, today he spoke in contrast to that moment. He spoke from the ornate Senate floor, the very seat of his actual elected power, co-equal branch of government, which oversees the department that employs the agents who actually manhandled him to the ground. That's different than how he looked the other day. And while the other day's confrontation did seem to escalate quickly, it did seem somewhat unexpected, including for Padilla, who discussed aspects of that on MSNBC. He spoke to Jacob Soboroff and me that night. So I mentioned that because that was sort of unexpected, and both sides referred to it because the DHS folks in their statements defending it sort of tried to act like, well, this all kind of popped up in the moment. And that's a contrast to today, another less prominent Democrat, New York City official Brad Lander, who's running for mayor, was arrested in a hallway outside an immigration court as he locked arms with a person ICE agents were seeking to detain. You can see the somewhat dramatic video, the clash, the people there. Now, this has drawn notice and comparisons, but it's actually distinct from Padilla's interaction. And if Democrats or other activists are courting more direct clashes like this, including with federal agents, it may reflect that some in today's evolving resistance want chances to do civil disobedience, or in their view, to highlight what they see as an overreach of federal agents under the Trump administration. And by the way, that has a long tradition in America. But it's also factually and legally different from a situation where you might think or observe that agents are openly seeking these clashes or even escalating these moments on their own. DHS says that Lander basically impeded a law enforcement officer. That's a potential crime. No charges have yet been brought.
Just a warrant. You have a judicial warrant. You have a judicial warrant. And I see the judicial warrant. And I see the warrant. I will let go when you show me the judicial warrant. Well, where is it? Where is it? Go. There you go. Oh, I was like, let's go. You go warrant. I know that. Go. Go. Like, see the warrant. Like that. Put it in the snow. Take it back down. Take it back. Take it back. Step back. Step back. Step back. Step back. You don't have authority. Step back. You don't have authority to arrest U.S. citizens. Step back, sir. You don't have the authority to arrest U.S. citizens.
You can see Lander there speaking. You can see, by the way, that video was released by his office, and he is a candidate right now running for mayor. All of that is context. But you can also see what looks like quite a difficult scenario for everyone involved. And so we are witnessing in kind of real time how these things are going down. I mentioned the long history of civil disobedience, not to say it's exactly the same, but the civil rights movement, a lot of Black and brown activists and allies of those movements did all of these kind of things, the sit-ins and efforts sometimes to be arrested, going in knowing you're going to be arrested. Now, we don't know whether with Padilla and some of these other incidents that seem to happen. We also know that there are other ongoing cases against elected Democrats that look more punitive, and judges will have to decide if they think that is overreach, if the Trump administration is literally trying to round up, arrest, and imprison the opposition. That's over here. Padilla, which on both sides seemed a little unexpected, is here. And as we kind of follow these stories, the new one, Lander, who's not necessarily a national figure, might be more here. He's putting out a video of that interaction, which he seemed to court quite deliberately. Now, against all of this backdrop, we have the vitriol on part of the right. More heat on Republican Senator Mike Lee, who put out those terrible posts about this weekend's assassination. We reported on The Beat about that vitriol. Lee trafficking in conspiracy theories and his version of what he thinks is a joke or mockery of a brand new assassination with people murdered. Also, we have to note it's quite the descent from his past claims, Mike Lee, that Trump was the irresponsible one and he wouldn't endorse Trump in 2016 for those reasons, whereas now he has moved to the fringe right, or whatever you want to call it, right, or the bottom, going after the victims of an assassination and murder this weekend. So he'd courted that fringe and conspiracy theory attention with these posts over the weekend. Tonight, after outrage, he is backing down a little bit. Minnesota Senator Tina Smith confronting Lee there in a hallway, which senators know will be seen. Photos will be taken. That's a very public environment. She says she wanted to stand up to him on behalf of people that she and her colleagues knew who are dead this week, who are gone because of that political violence, which he clearly minimized and joked about. She then recounted that.
I wanted to speak to Senator Lee directly about the impact of what he had put out on social media, the impact it had on me, his colleague, and other people in Minnesota. He posted a picture of this assassin, presumably shortly before he killed my friend and a political leader in Minnesota. And I think it is important that people who have such a huge megaphone, like Senator Lee, think carefully about what they are doing and what impact it will have. Over 7 million people engaged with that social media tweet. And that is power that he should be using to calm the storm and not to fuel the fire.
Everything she says checks out. She is using her role and power to try to counter the problem, but the problem is coming from within the United States Senate. And there are other better things that a Minnesota lawmaker could do this week as they prepare these funerals, these memorials, security, ongoing law enforcement actions. There's a lot to deal with after those horrific shootings this weekend. But she has to do this because to not confront it, she says, she feels, and seems pretty believable, would be to let it stand as her friend murdered is dishonored by her colleague that she's still supposed to work with. This is not normal times, and this is not normal or acceptable conduct. Other people who are used to plenty of hardball, tough politics and name calling and all the rest also found this over the line. One of her aides wrote a letter to Lee's aides, so that's sort of the teams that work with each other, right? The Senate is still a set of offices where people work with each other, telling their counterparts, I pray that if God forbid you ever find yourself having to deal with anything similar, you find yourselves on the receiving end of the kind of grace and compassion that Senator Mike Lee could not muster. The letter continuing with this question that you might recognize, quote, have you absolutely no conscience, no decency, It's a fair question when you're mocking people who were just murdered as the country and their friends and family learn and grieve about it. The question also echoes a very famous one put to another fringe senator who ultimately did flame out after a lot of damage, Joe McCarthy, when, during one of his vaunted hearings, he was asked, "Have you no decency at long last? Have you no decency, sir?" And that time, without the internet or X to post and boost and monetize and profit off this sort of grim murder joking, but at that time, the nation did also face its own version of politically fueled conspiracy theories that not only harm people, but in the case of those Army McCarthy hearings and the other sort of red baiting, they shut down entire careers and lives for years. Some people went to prison for doing little more than offering brave dissent against that discredited red baiting. So that question, have you no decency, echoes right now. As for Republican Mike Lee, who said he used to oppose Donald Trump because of the irresponsible statements he made and now is what he is, I don't need to add adjectives. You can decide for yourself what you think he is. But for his part, Mike Lee is on the run.
Do you regret your tweet? Do you stand by the post that you made on X?
Have you had a productive conversation about that post? Was that what the senator wanted to speak to you about?
He can hear them. He made these posts to get attention. Now he apparently cannot handle it. Senator Lee can try to run from the press and run from his own scandal, but he's ultimately running from what he said, from what he chose and chooses to say. There is wisdom even in hard times like this. Bob Marley put it very simply. You're running and you're running and you're running away, but you can't run away from yourself. So if Mike Lee doesn't have the words to explain himself, what he said, did, and stands for, that's a Mike Lee problem. And there will be people with cameras and memories to follow him around if this is how he uses, or as his Minnesota counterpart says, misuses his power and reach. Days later, he has, under this pressure, deleted those posts, but he hasn't spoken out or apologized or explained anything. It is a lesson that everyone knows all the way back to the schoolyard, even if we wish some of our politicians and senators aimed and lived above the standards of the schoolyard. But some of the loudest bullies, or today they call them trolls, they're so loud, talking behind people's back, telling jokes about people who were murdered. And then when you confront them, the bullies become the quietest of the bunch. We'll all be waiting for Mike Lee. He's been on this program once before. If he wants to come on and answer real questions about this, some of them probably hard questions, he can come on here. But a lot of people will be waiting for him to explain himself as he runs from himself. Now, that is some of the unfortunate fireworks or intense emotional clashes that are going on right now in this tough week. I also want to turn to the important but somewhat more dry process as promised inside that appeals court in California. The panel of judges hearing arguments over Trump's federalization of the National Guard and DOJ lawyers defending how Trump called up those forces.
Our view is that this statute commits the decision whether to call up the forces to the president's unreviewable discretion. So no, there's no role for the court to play in reviewing that decision.
No role at all, even if the president gives no reasons and there are no facts offered by that president to support that president's decision.
That's correct, because if the statute is unreviewable, it's unreviewable.
If it's unreviewable, it's unreviewable. Now, this is not one of those out of bounds bananas arguments that we sometimes hear in these court cases, even if it does sound pretty stark. In other words, at the limits of what the DOJ is saying, it'd be a lot of power for any president or this president. But let's just go through it in plain English. The DOJ is just arguing that for courts, they think the National Guard is like deploying the actual military. And it is a power that presidents usually wield with no review by judges in real time. In other words, if a president goes to war in Iraq with or without Congress or does a military operation, typically you don't see judges come in and interfere with that in real time. Now, California has the counter argument that the National Guard is different and different than the military precisely because it involves a dueling power of the state. And under that thing called federalism, states do have everything you know about when you live in a state. Even if you're not like the biggest government expert, you probably look around and know, yeah, we have this state government, right? Local police, not federal agents. The FBI is not on your, subway or pulling you over on the highway usually. And you have your governor, and you have rules that are written in that state and your own law enforcement. All of that is state power, and that America, according to governors like Gavin Newsom and the lawyers he sent to argue this case today, America's never been run completely out of D.C. with no regard for that structure.
It should also consider the profound effect on our federal structure of government and the balance of power between states and the federal government. Our framers made the decision, it's reflected in the text of Article 1's militia clauses, to generally leave to state governments control over the militia, today the National Guard.
That's the California counterargument. And I'll just tell you straight up, this is one of those times where both arguments are decent, because the military is a bigger deal, and that is not reviewable, to use the jargon, or not something the judges are messing with day to day. But on the California side, yeah, the state has power. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this whole system if any president could just overrule at any time with no facts, as the judge warned. And California is not freelancing here. This isn't just some Newsom Trump thing. There's a cornerstone in the United States democracy on separation of powers and a state system of powers. It's very striking, by the way, that we just had these protests about no kings, because one of the ways the founders originally wanted to ward off the king-like power from the very top of the government to send your agents in anywhere in the country was that they would have localized powers, state powers, federalism, to distinguish the U.S. from the kings of England.
Our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government, but we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states. The power of one must check and balance the other.
States balance the federal power. You can believe John Adams or Paul Giamatti's version of John Adams, which I gotta believe is as charismatic or more so. And anybody who knows anything about power knows that at the end of the day, it's not about what's written in the little books and the rules, precedents. Power is about power, which comes down to the guns and the arms. We're a country that's had many big debates about that. But the state power is that you have police and National Guard under the state governor. They really do control law enforcement and safety in their respective states, not the FBI most of the time. And if you do want to put on a political hat here tonight as we make sense of all these related controversies, for a very long time in the modern era, it was Republican leaders who said a lot about respecting state power, which Donald Trump obviously isn't. He's in court today trying to overrule a governor on the National Guard. Reagan warned against all of that kind of federal power aggrandizement.
We must remove government's smothering hand from where it does harm. We must seek to revitalize the proper functions of government. But we do these things to set loose again the energy and the ingenuity of the American people.
The people through the states and their local government first, and the feds as a last resort. That was Reagan Republican politics. Trump has a very different idea, federalizing the troops, aggrandizing his power, unilateral authority, and telling the courts to back out. Now, there's talk about the reasoning. The law in question actually requires an invasion or rebellion. The president would deploy the Guard only in those cases. And if Donald Trump gets his way, then maybe this statute sort of fades away, and an order favoring Trump would empower him to use the Guard not only in California, but if he wins this case and it's open season, in every state in the land. And that would be whether John Adams likes it or not. So on all of the above, we bring in two great guests when we return in 90 seconds.
Donald Trump has got to go.
We're back with Jason Johnson and Joyce Vance. Joyce, your thoughts on these clashes and how the courts will have to make some decisions here in questions that really do go to whether or not there are king-like powers.
We're so early in this decision tree, Ari. I think it's important to say right now we're looking in the Ninth Circuit today at whether the president can nationalize a state's National Guard and bring them in. Of course, that doesn't begin to look at the question of whether the president can legitimately use Marines on American soil, or does that violate our prohibition against using the military for domestic law enforcement? And the upcoming confrontation involves the Supreme Court, which has been very willing to entertain this notion of a sort of maximalist president with enormous powers that we have not traditionally ascribed to an American president, powers that people might say are king-like in many ways. That, I think, is the larger environment in which we're viewing all of these events, and it's important to keep them in context.
Jason? All the above, not just the case.
This whole case really relies upon the president's ability to convince a judge or convince the regular American people that Los Angeles was a mess. And they wanted to make it look like the protests were the No Church of the Wild video. There was just everything being destroyed. And I've said in many times that that's not the case. I was in Los Angeles. The majority of the protests were downtown. It was a very constrained area one way or another. So on the facts of the case, there was no emergency. There was no chaos. There was no invasion.
You're making a serious point with a lighthearted reference. I think a lot of cars were destroyed in that video, that music video, but go on.
Yes. This is true. This is true. And only 3 Waymo cars were actually destroyed downtown Los Angeles. But I think the other important thing to remember here is that all that Trump is doing is trying to set a precedent for how he'll operate in other cities, right? Gavin Newsom is going to stand up to him. California has a lot of power economically and politically that Trump can't penetrate at this point. But will the same thing happen in Texas? Probably not with Abbott. Will the same sort of thing happen in Atlanta, Georgia? Probably not with Kemp. So my concern is whether or not the president is successful in taking control of the National Guard in the state of California. He's still using this as a guidepost for what he wants to do in states where the governors may not be as strong or more likely to resist.
And Jason, on the political side, slightly more for you than Joyce, although I'm interested in Joyce's views on, I'd say, just about everything. When you look at this, where I said, is Mike Lee to the right of MAGA fringe conspiracy, or is he to the bottom, or is he subterranean when it comes to basic decency? What does it tell you that on the one hand he deleted, so he wanted attention, he got more than his share, but he still hasn't addressed this as any decent person would?
Well, this is the thing, Ari. Mike Lee is a coward. I mean, I'm just going to say that you are a coward. If you're going to say something like that, then you need to either stand 10 toes down and explain why you said it, or actually make a public apology. And what he confronted, which you mentioned before about trolls and bullies, when Congressman Smith actually went up to him, he was dealing with the say it to my face energy that many of these Republican trolls don't face, right? Someone actually saying, okay, go ahead, say that to me while we're all in mourning. And he couldn't do it. And I think that was an important step on her behalf, but it's also a reflection of the lack of conviction that he has in anything he says. He's used to just being able to throw rocks and hide his hand, and this time he couldn't. But there's too many Republicans who operate that way and are able to hide because they're not confronted.
Well, Jason, some people say what you refer to, say it to my face. Some people say, do it again. You know, do it again. Come up here and do it right now.
Right, exactly. Pull up then, right? And he's not that person. And I would love to think that he will have learned his lesson from this, but I don't think so. And if it's not him, it's Jim Jordan. If it's not him, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. It has been an attitude of the Republican Party for a good 15 years now to just sort of say these things, hide when confronted, right? And then find an opportunity to say it again and hide in the right-wing echo chamber.
Joyce, your thoughts both on that sad part of the story, if you want, but also, given your background prosecuting tough cases, on where we are on this political violence. Each case is distinct, and it takes time to deal with a suspect, a defendant now, and go through more evidence and motive. And yet, as the Times put it, We are in a place now where this type of political violence, not always, thank God, completely lethal and successful, is becoming, quote, almost routine.
You know, not so long ago, there were two efforts to assassinate a political candidate, Donald Trump. And that was perhaps a moment where the parties had more unity than we had seen in a long time. Both sides of the aisle, people condemned political violence. That's what we have to always do when political violence happens in this country. Everyone of good faith should be condemning it. It doesn't matter who the perpetrator is. It doesn't matter who the victim is. If you are committed to a constitutional system of justice, a country that's a full-blown democracy, then there's simply no room to tolerate political violence. And so maybe the one political thing I'll say, Ari, about Senator Lee is he had such an opportunity here, an opportunity to stand up and be the grown-up in the room and say, I got carried away. Sometimes we all do that on social media, but I was wrong. I apologize to my friend, Senator Smith. I honor the legacy of these politicians in Minnesota, and he simply couldn't do it. That is very much the mood that Donald Trump has imposed on the Republican Party, and they have to break free from that.
Yeah, both you making important points. I appreciate that. Joyce Vance, Jason Johnson, our thanks. That official who faced the interaction today with those ICE agents, Brad Lander, will be on with Chris Hayes, 8 p.m. Eastern tonight. That's a programming note on a very newsy development there. When we come back, RFK Jr. exposed and fact-checked again, and the Trump family may get tariffed by Donald Trump because of their new foreign venture, as more cries of grifting fill the land. I'll explain.
When it comes to great stakes, I've just raised the stakes.
My new game is Trump, the game.
The God Bless the USA Bible. At Trump University, we teach success. That's what it's all about.
That's the real deal. That's the real deal.
Look, this is what he does. We've seen Donald Trump throughout his long life in media sell all kinds of things. Real estate, stakes, casinos, board games, Bibles, an online university that led to a settlement. Some of those things did make money. Others didn't or ended up in types of bankruptcies. If you believe in the Trump brand name, then you might just want to pay a premium for anything that slaps it on. That's how his family business works, and his sons have continued the tradition. They're now launching Trump Mobile as a phone and cell phone service. It is slated for this summer. Steep price, $499. You can see the gold. You can see MAGA fusing the political appeal with the sales pitch. And as Donald Trump has made the whole first 140 days about tariffs and foreign production, these new Trump phones will not necessarily be made in the U.S.
Today, we're here to introduce Trump Mobile. We can add more functionality. We can do it cheaper. We can do it better. And eventually, all the phones can be built in the United States of America.
Eventually, which any lawyer or salesperson will tell you means not right now. The Wall Street Journal notes Trump's smartphone can't be made in America for $499 by August. There are ways this works with supply chains and records, and so they can authoritatively tell you it will be made abroad, while Trump rages about people making things abroad, and he would appear to have, and his family business has, the capital not to do it. CNBC says the phones were likeliest to be made in China, which has been the biggest target of the Trump tariffs. Now, Trump has promised that 25% tariff on all phones made outside the U.S., and he has threatened what would now be the competitor to his son's family business, you know, the big phone maker, Apple CEO, Tim Cook.
I had an understanding with Tim that he wouldn't be doing this. He said he's going to India to build plants. I said, that's okay to go to India, but you're not going to sell into here without tariffs. And that's the way it is.
That's the way it is. You get tariffed if you do that. Wired reports that a customer service representative told them that Trump's mobile phone wouldn't be affected, though, by tariffs. That's hard to square with the seeming acknowledgement from Trump's sons that his phone will be manufactured overseas, at least at first. you really couldn't make up a better example of why there is so much concern about these types of conflicts and so much skepticism of Donald Trump's claims that he wants to use tariffs or trade wars to defend you, the American consumer, or the American labor market, when they're literally launching new Trump phones made abroad, probably in China. We're going to fit in a break, but there are some new setbacks for Trump as Harvard fights back. And next, RFK Jr. and the vaccine fact check. Trump Health Secretary RFK Jr. again under the spotlight after ousting experts from the vaccine panel, pushing vaccine misinformation, and now in this resurfaced exchange, you can see him making false vaccine statements.
There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
Those are big words. What about the polio?
The polio vaccine contained a virus called simian virus 40, SV40, and now you've had this explosion of soft tissue cancers in our generation that kill many, 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 many more people than polio ever did.
The attempt to link the polio vaccine, which is one of the most successful ever, to separate diseases is a false type of link. It's misinformation, even if there may also be other problems and other diseases that exist. Most studies find no causal relationship between what Kennedy mentions there and cancer. Although cancer is a huge problem, it's not caused by the polio vaccine. Indeed, when you look at this type of chart over many decades, you can see why it is one of the most celebrated vaccines that saves children and people from polio. Now, Kennedy's done that government purge, ousting all the experts that were previously selected to do vaccine work for the Centers for Disease Control and review the science and work on shots. Again, a lot of people went through the COVID experience, and there's rich debate over how we handled it, but the general fact that vaccines throughout world history save lives is not really in question. 17 of those fired experts are speaking out and saying that that move could roll back the achievements of the immunization policy that saved so many lives. And then you have the vaccine falsehoods that are promoted by Kennedy at odds with scientific evidence, and you can see how the United States is moving backwards on these issues under the Trump administration. When we come back, Harvard fighting back and winning. More setbacks for the Trump administration in that Harvard clash, a judge extending a blockage on Trump's effort to punish the school by preventing foreign students from attending. That clash is part of what critics say is a larger effort towards autocratic government control. Acclaimed and best-selling author Francis Fukuyama joins us to discuss this link between democracy and trust. One of the things that I saw sort of collapse in a transpartisan or bipartisan way during pandemic, you had folks saying not that they had the evidence for a given conspiracy theory about COVID, but rather they had the history and lived experience of skepticism or more is valid. What do you say to that? And how do you, as someone, you're an empiricist, how do you acknowledge the reality of that lived reality?
If you don't have a certain basic level of trust in what it's saying, what are you going to replace it with? Are you going to replace it with any notion that you simply pull off of the internet because, some influencer said it? And so I think that we have to go back to try to reestablish the credibility of certain institutions. I'll tell you one thing I'm worried about right now. People, by and large, trust economic statistics, GDP growth rates, unemployment rates. These are produced by something called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's been regarded as an apolitical office. One of the things that's happened is that the current administration is trying to replace all of the heads. They're protected by what's called for-cause removal. So you can't just fire them because it's a new administration, because they are regarded as sources of credible, nonpartisan information.
I want to turn now to what you memorably called the end of history. It's hard today, I think, to fully absorb what a profound shift it was to have the Cold War which was lived as an existential threat to humanity across both sides of the divide for decades, rather abruptly come to an end. So because we have TV, you have scholarship and words and research, but we have the archive. So I just want to briefly remind everyone of that moment.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Tens of thousands of people crossing into West Berlin, pouring through the Berlin Wall, which opened today.
Such an astonishing moment in history.
We stand at the threshold of a brand new era. That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
This is an area of your most known and controversial scholarship. Can't think of a bigger human topic for that era. Starting there, what happened and what was your argument about why it happened and where we were headed through the decline and the end of that Cold War?
Well, the word history did not refer to just the occurrence of events one after another. I was using history with a capital H, the idea that there is a progressive narrative that you can elaborate about the development of human institutions over long periods of time. And in my view, we had progressed from primitive hunter-gatherer societies to agrarian ones, to feudalism, to modern capitalism and democracy.
Let me jump in to read how you put it then. This was 1989. Witnessing, you said, not just the end of the Cold War, but the passing of a period of post-war history, the end of history as such, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The concern now is that a certain type of market capitalism may have overtaken most of the earth, with most of the human production being subservient to it, but not the liberal democracy part. Is that a fair concern?
Well, it's a concern because I think the biggest challenger to my thesis is really China, which is an authoritarian country that employs, market economics to some extent. But in defense of the original assertion, I would say that what is not so easily reversible is the basic concept that was embodied both in the American and French revolutions, which had to do with the equality of dignity or the equality of rights. Now, obviously, the United States did not live up to that, remotely in 1789 at the founding of the country, but progressively there's been this expansion of rights to broader and broader groups of people. I don't really see is a challenge to that principle that would say, no, that's wrong. There are many people that deny rights to their citizens, but the principle is one that I think is actually pretty durable, and I don't see it being replaced by an alternative principle right now.
Really fascinating. Before I let you go, since we set aside time here for you to join us on the beat, I wanted to just turn to the slightly more personal or fun stuff. You've become sort of a nerdy star, if you take that as a compliment. From what I can tell from reading your work, you didn't seek that out. Did that surprise you? Did you have to adjust to that? Do you like it?
Well, yeah, it's funny, I have a lot of hobbies. I like to build things. And what I've been building has changed over time. So I started out, with furniture. I made the beds for all my kids, our kitchen table, this sort of thing. I got tired of that. I moved on. I learned how to put drones together, how to fly an FPV drone. That's been one of my more recent ones.
I really appreciate, Professor Fukuyama, you being generous with your ideas and time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Our thanks to such an acclaimed thinker and, frankly, pretty easygoing, humble man. You can see the rest of that interview at msnbc.com/ARI for the whole thing. We'll be right back. More setbacks for the Trump administration in that Harvard clash, a judge extending a blockage on Trump's effort to punish the school by preventing foreign students from attending. That clash is part of what critics say is a larger effort towards autocratic government control. Acclaimed and best-selling author Francis Fukuyama joins us to discuss this link between democracy and trust. One of the things that I saw sort of collapse in a transpartisan or bipartisan way during pandemic, you had folks saying not that they had the evidence for a given conspiracy theory about COVID, but rather they had the history and lived experience of skepticism or more is valid. What do you say to that? And how do you, as someone, you're an empiricist, how do you acknowledge the reality of that lived reality?
If you don't have a certain basic level of trust in what it's saying, what are you going to replace it with? Are you going to replace it with any notion that you simply pull off of the internet because some influencer said it? And so I think that we have to go back to try to reestablish the credibility of certain institutions. I'll tell you one thing I'm worried about right now. People, by and large, trust economic statistics. GDP growth rates, unemployment rates. These are produced by something called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's been regarded as an apolitical office. One of the things that's happened is that the current administration is trying to replace all of the heads. They're protected by what's called for-cause removal. So you can't just fire them because it's a new administration, because they are regarded as sources of credible, nonpartisan information.
I want to turn now to what you memorably called the end of history. It's hard today, I think, to fully absorb what a profound shift it was to have the Cold War, which was lived as an existential threat to humanity across both sides of the divide for decades, rather abruptly come to an end. So because we have TV, you have scholarship and words and research, but we have the archive. So I just want to briefly remind everyone of that moment.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Tens of thousands of people crossing into West Berlin, pouring through the Berlin Wall, which opened today.
Such an astonishing moment in history.
We stand at the threshold of a brand new era. That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
This is an area of your most known and controversial scholarship. Can't think of a bigger human topic for that era. Starting there, what happened and what was your argument about why it happened and where we were headed through the decline and the end of that Cold War?
Well, the word history did not refer to just the occurrence of events one after another. I was using history with a capital H, the idea that there is a progressive narrative that you can elaborate about the development of human institutions over long periods of time. And in my view, we had progressed from primitive hunter-gatherer societies to agrarian ones, to feudalism, to modern capitalism and democracy.
Let me jump in to read how you put it then. This was 1989. Witnessing, you said, not just the end of the Cold War, but the passing of a period of post-war history, the end of history as such, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The concern now is that a certain type of market capitalism may have overtaken most of the earth, with most of the human production being subservient to it, but not the liberal democracy part. Is that a fair concern?
Well, it's a concern because I think the biggest challenger to my thesis is really China, which is an authoritarian country that employs, market economics to some extent. But in defense of the original assertion, I would say that what is not so easily reversible is the basic concept that was embodied both in the American and French revolutions, which had to do with the equality of dignity or the equality of rights. Now, obviously, the United States did not live up to that. Remotely in 1789 at the founding of the country, but progressively there's been this expansion of rights to broader and broader groups of people. I don't really see is a challenge to that principle that would say, no, that's wrong. There are many people that deny rights to their citizens, but the principle is one that I think is actually pretty durable, and I don't see it being replaced by an alternative principle right now.
Really fascinating. Before I let you go, since we set aside time here for you to join us on the beat, I wanted to just turn to the slightly more personal or fun stuff. You've become sort of a nerdy star, if you take that as a compliment. From what I can tell from reading your work, you didn't seek that out. Did that surprise you? Did you have to adjust to that? Do you like it?
Well, yeah, it's funny, I have a lot of hobbies. I like to build things. And what I've been building has changed over time. So I started out, with furniture. I made the beds for all my kids, our kitchen table, this sort of thing. I got tired of that. I moved on. I learned how to put drones together, how to fly an FPV drone. That's been one of my more recent ones.
I really appreciate, Professor Fukuyama, you being generous with your ideas and time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Our thanks to such an acclaimed thinker and, frankly, pretty easygoing, humble man. You can see the rest of that interview at msnbc.com/ARI for the whole thing. We'll be right back. We are witnessing still a ton of reaction, traction, and impact from the 5 million Americans who beat expectations and turned out for those Trump No Kings protests this weekend. The president spent the day at the military parade, and that contrast was noticed in late night.
It was a relatively reserved, not particularly well-attended event that left all the VIPs lucky enough to see it bored out of the lives.
Basically a $50 million version of when a 5-year-old shows you every car in his Hot Wheels collection.
You can command an army and deploy troops and have unlimited wealth and power, but you still can't force people to come to your birthday party.
No, if it's a real party, people have to want to be there. And shout out to everyone who did want to honor the military. The joke's there about the president's style. Now, we had Francis Fukuyama on tonight, who has been a part of our Summit series, where we've heard from people like Bill Gates, Tom Hanks, Clive Davis, Fran Lebowitz. I want to remind you, because we love these longer form conversations, some of what we're learning.
Being judgmental, to me, just means I have standards.
Well, let's just go through it. They scream, "Brace for impact."
This is a real Dr. Jane Goodall Barbie.
A Barbie doll that encourages little girls to think that I can do that.
Reaching the summit means
trying harder every day.
Peace and fulfillment. I feel like I'm in the foothills.
You have done something positive with the power that the summit has given you.
That I haven't got there yet, I hope.
Jane Goodall telling us she hasn't gotten there, and she means it. One of the interesting people who's devoted their life's work to enriching the world around them. You can see some of the other folks there. And I want to remind you, we keep this list up so you can go watch these videos anytime. MSNBC.com/summit, MSNBC.com/SUMMIT. You can see any of those folks on our YouTube playlist. Thanks for watching The Beat tonight. A lot going on. We'll stay on the case for you.